In a universe with sentient Death Star building bugs, force power augmented killing machines, and honestly a whole lot worse, if you suffer one of the galaxy's worst ways to die, you're really going out in a bad way. We're going to talk about 5 of them on today's video. Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars video. The Star Wars universe is a really fun mix of science fiction and fantasy. You get space battles on one hand, magic on the other. The deaths we'll talk about today cover both sides of the universe. Now, as a disclaimer, although I'm talking primarily about clear deaths, I will also include some situations where a person hasn't died but has essentially lost their life in some other way. And the best example of this will be illustrated by my first choice, Entekment. Entekment was first introduced in the Star Wars Expanded Universe novel The Truce at Bakura. Shortly after the destruction of the second Death Star, the planet Bakura sends a distress signal to the Empire, claiming they're being invaded by a warlike species known as the Sea Rook. The Empire, having just lost Palpatine, the Death Star, and much of their senior military leadership, is kind of busy, so the Rebel Alliance sends a small task force led by Luke Skywalker to help. At Bakura, the rebels discover that the Sea Rook use a technology seemingly unique to their species, Entekment, a process where a being's life energy is used to power Sea Ruvi technology. Essentially, a being's soul is ripped from their body and placed within some machine, whether a starfighter, a life support unit on a space station, a trash compactor, whatever. What makes this worse, however, is that the being's consciousness not only persists, stuck in essentially nothingness, but also suffers extreme pain. The Entekment technology of the Sea Ruvi was so dangerous because after they conquered a planet, they could essentially turn its populace into energy for their machines, making their threat nearly existential. Humans were especially potent sources of Intect energy. I've covered the Truce of Bakura many times on this channel, from deeper dives into Entekment to battle breakdowns. If you're interested, just take a search. So, while this wasn't technically a death of the soul, it was a loss of a being's physical body, and the only escape from Entekment itself was a final death. Alright, with number 2, we're going to stay somewhat on topic, and I'm really just going to lump together a bunch of different soul-catching devices. Most famously, we have the Thought Bomb, as featured heavily throughout the Star Wars Expanded Universe, from the first book of the Darth Bane trilogy, to Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, to various comics. And you may already be familiar with the Thought Bomb for that reason, but I'll briefly recap. The Thought Bomb was an ancient Sith technique used most famously at the 7th Battle of Ruusan, though there are older related Sith techniques that I'm simply going to lump together with this one. Put simply, the Thought Bomb is a devastating ability which destroys everything in its path. However, while the physical is annihilated, the souls and consciousness of Force-sensitive beings become trapped in the shell left after the bomb's firing. Those inside suffer torment for what could be eternity. I'll read from Path of Destruction. Caught on the fringes of the Thought Bomb's radius, Kithany was not so lucky. The wave of pure dark side energy swept over her an instant later. It tore through her like some terrible wind, sucking the essence of life from her body and ripping her spirit from its corporeal shell. Her flesh withered and shrank, her beautiful features mummified before she had even time to scream. Many of the Jedi wept in anguish, understanding how great the sacrifice of their fallen comrades had been. The spirits of the dead were bound for all eternity, frozen forever in stasis. This is from the second book, but it gives more context. Through the Force, they had heard the agonized screams of their fellow Jedi as their spirits were torn apart and swept up in the swirling vortex of dark side energy. The worst thing is, your soul persists, if you're Force sensitive anyway, forever within the bomb, at least until you're released, as was the case with those at the 7th Battle of Ruusan, who were released about 1,000 years later by Kyle Katarn. The Thought Bomb was such a devastating weapon that it was what led the Jedi Order to believe the Sith extinct for 1,000 years. As I alluded to, however, being hit by the Thought Bomb was not the only way to find your soul wrenched from its body and left in limbo. We have, for example, the story of Exar Kun. He believed in siphoning the life force of the Masashi from Yavin 4, that he would ascend beyond the physical form, traveling through space at will. However, he became tethered in spirit form to his temple on Yavin 4. We also learn in the Junior Jedi Knight series that many of the Masashi children had their energy and life force trapped in what was known as the Golden Globe. So not only did his attempt to transcend the physical end up terribly for him, but also his subjects. And again, there are many examples of this in Star Wars Legends. But there's one which I think is horrific enough to deserve its own entry, and that is the death of Darth Tenebris specifically. Darth Tenebris was the master of Darth Plagueis. He dies in the novel Plagueis, but we learn more about his perspective from the short story The Tenebris Way by Matthew Stover. In that novella, we learn that Tenebris has prepared for his death, that he's ready through brute force to transfer his soul to another living being, and eventually the Chosen One, who he sensed coming. He created what were known as maxi-chlorians, which at his death were to transfer to the body of Plagueis and facilitate the transfer of his soul, and he's somewhat successful. After dying, he retains his consciousness, but as he attempts to transfer himself to Plagueis' body, he feels anguish and pain, a recognition that Plagueis would be killed too early by his own apprentice, Palpatine. In a panic, he retreats his maxi-chlorians and does end up achieving eternal life. However, it's in reliving his death. What if his eternal life would be this? Or worse, what if his foresight hadn't been eliminated, but had been somehow twisted in upon himself? What if his remains were ancient because this was the 1,000th time he had relived his death? What if it was the millionth, the billionth? Then he knew, and at that moment he wished he'd still had a mouth because he really, really needed to scream. The other being strapped through whatever force device or weapon at least had the eventual possibility of reprieve. Tenebris, however, is trapped for eternity. All right, before we move on to the 4th and 5th entries on this list, I will give a few honorable mentions. There's the Krytos virus from the X-Wing series. Basically, it liquefies your muscles, organs, and skin. It's just terrible. I've done a video all on it. Same with a Nal infection. I'm not including that one because it's been covered ad nauseum on this channel and really only comes from one source book. I almost included Nil Spar, who at the end of the Black Fleet crisis is ejected into hyperspace in an escape pod, basically left there to slowly starve and die, driven to madness as well, most likely by hyperspace. And of course, there's many other options, from the Sarlacc to having your soul sucked by Waru, and many, many more. At number 4, however, we have Capture and Death by Yuuzhan Vong. The Yuuzhan Vong had many terrible ways to kill people, and honestly, Vector Prime in the journey into that first world ship is one of the scariest moments in Star Wars. As Jason rescues Danny and the other, we discover that the Yuuzhan Vong are uniquely alien and that their organic technology is basically designed to violate and disturb any other living being. The Yuuzhan Vong worshipped pain and they doled it out in heaps to their victims. The Embrace of Pain was a uniquely evil technology. You can imagine the torture chair we see Han in Episode 5. The Embrace of Pain is an organic version of that and significantly worse. It evaluated its subject's brain and gave the person as much pain as they could possibly take through the use of organic needles, shocks, fire, pulling, and more. It was the ultimate torture device, and many in the Star Wars galaxy fell victim to it. The Embrace also provided nutrients and medical care so its subject could survive for as long as possible. Jason was in it for some time, and it played a major role in his conversion to a Sith Lord, and really traumatized him for the rest of his life. However, the Vong used other terrible biots, Yuuzhan Vong organic technology, including the Yorick coal, which was implanted in captured populace and used to turn them into mindless drones, slaves, or warriors. The Yuuzhan Vong was terrible for civilians because the galaxy was invaded by this species which had completely different and terrifying norms, and which specifically targeted civilian populations for information or for the labor that they could extract through technologies like the Yorick Cull. Moving on, however, we have our final terrible way to die, and that is at the hands, or tentacles, of Abeloth. One of the worst things about dying to Abeloth is the lead up. Now, we're going to be very brief here because Abeloth deserves individual lore videos, and I've made plenty in the past, but she had a massive psychic presence which she could project throughout the entire galaxy. She drove many Jedi to madness while also causing them to question their reality, to think that those around them were imposters. Generally, she fed and became more powerful based on the suffering inflicted to those around her, which is why she does such terrible things to the planet Coruscant in Fate of the Jedi. Perhaps the worst fate, however, was to attract the individual attention of Abeloth, which isn't surprising. Abeloth is essentially a Lovecraftian creature in Star Wars. She's terrible and destructive beyond comprehension. We see this specifically as she inhabits other bodies. I'll read specifically from Fate of the Jedi Apocalypse. Rokari Kem's fingers grew long and thin, and suddenly her arms dissolved into gray, slimy tentacles, and in the Sith's place stood the hideous thing that Wynn had glimpsed on waking, a slender, sinuate form with coarse yellow hair and a mouth so broad that it reached from ear to ear. Abeloth. Pogorski's jaw fell open in a wordless scream. The tentacle shot down her throat into her ears and nostrils and began to pulse. Horrible gagging sounds erupted from her mouth. Her entire body went limp, convulsing by the ropey tendrils that had been inserted into her head. Finally, her expression went blank. Complexion grew pale and translucent so Wynn could see tentacles throbbing inside her face, pumping something dark and viscous into her sinuses and ears and down into her trachea. The cell reverberated with a low, growling howl that he did not recognize as his own voice until he found himself crouching in the corner, gnawing at his knuckles and banging his skull against the durasteel. The thing turned its gruesome head towards Wynn's corner, then fixed its blazing white eyes on him and smiled a grin as deep and dark as the maw itself. Now that you'll be serving me, you should know that your beloved Queen of the Stars is so much more than a Sith. So yeah, Abeloth was terrible. She has the classic Lovecraftian feature of being so terrible, she drives mere mortals to insanity, and getting her attention is, to put it lightly, not ideal. Abeloth took control of many bodies and subjugated them to her will, and that couldn't have been a good way to go out. But those are the 5 worst ways to die in Star Wars Legends, at least 5 really, really bad ones. If there's one which didn't make the list you think should have, let me know, of course, down below. And if there's a topic you'd like to see covered in more detail, also let me know. The topic of souls being lost to the ether is extremely common. Same with spirits persisting long beyond their time. You know, that was one of the principles of the Sith versus the Jedi explained by George Lucas. The Jedi were happy to move on, to accept death and become a part of the Force. The Sith tried to cling to life and as such often ended up far worse in a desperate attempt to keep their power. I also thought about talking the eventual fate of Jacen Solo and others after his death as we experience in Fate of the Jedi, but I'll also save that for a future video. Until next time, be safe, have a good one, and may the Force be with you.